Hello, my name is Carol Birkin. I'm the Presidential Professor of American History, Emerita. That means I've retired from Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And today we're going to talk about women of the American Revolution, the remarkable stories I think it's likely you've never heard. I want to begin. Do you remember these iconic images of the American Revolution? To a great extent, they appeared in every textbook probably you ever encountered, and they might come back to you. Here's the British redcoats firing into a crowd of Americans. Here's colonists disguised as Native Americans dumping tea into the harbor. They really look quite ferocious in this illustration. Here is Patrick Henry proclaiming, "Give me liberty or give me death." We don't know if he really said that, but we say he did anyway. Here's Common Sense, the cover of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, the document that called the king a royal brute and helped sever the ties between the American colonists and the British. Here's the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which we say was the shot heard round the world. Here's patriots dressed in breeches and many of them wearing wigs, signing the Declaration of Independence. George Washington standing tall as he's rowed across the Delaware River. I'm sure by now all of you know that, in fact, they went across the Delaware River on rafts, and I'm sure if you've ever been in a rowboat, you would know that given the ice and the wind and the snow, had he stood up, he would be in the river, not sailing across the river. Weary soldiers traipsing barefoot through the snow at Valley Forge. And finally, political leaders gathering at what came to be known as Independence Hall to draft the Constitution. Now, our question for today is, where are the women? Did women not know that a war for independence was going on, being fought for 7 years right in their backyards? In 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, Americans toasted the king, they toasted Parliament, they exclaimed how lucky they were to be part of the British Empire. They were so proud of the rights of Englishmen, and 2 years later, they were rioting in the streets. What had happened is obvious to those of you who've read about the Revolution. England was broke. The war had cost them every penny they had, and they were in debt to people who had lent them money. And they decided to try to raise money, and they turned their attention to the American colonies. Between 1775 and 1774, they began to pass laws that were an attempt to collect revenue from the Americans. In the course of that time, many of the Americans came to see England not as their protector, not as their mother country, but instead as a evil tyranny attempting to enslave the American colonists. Now, they said this in the halls of the legislatures in every colony. They orated Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death." They wrote petitions to the British Parliament saying, "Sirs, come to your senses. This is against our rights as Englishmen. You must repeal the Stamp Act. You must repeal the Townshend Acts." The Parliament's response to this was, it didn't really move them at all. The Americans then got smart, and they said, the political leaders in the Stamp Act Congress, they said, if we can't persuade them by appealing to their better natures, then maybe we can persuade them to repeal this dreaded Stamp Act and later on the Townshend Acts by appealing to their pocketbooks. And they encouraged Americans everywhere, colonists everywhere, to engage in non-importation and non-consumption of British goods. They didn't have the word yet, boycott. That was invented in the 19th century. So they had to use this rather clunky phrase. And they said, do not buy anything made in England. Do not buy anything shipped through England. Do not buy anything that a merchant has in your town that came from England, that's in his inventory. Completely boycott these items. Now, the majority, the most important item that they could boycott was textiles, because the British Industrial Revolution, the engine of that in the 18th century was the production of cloth. And American women had purchased this cloth, had gone for this cloth in the biggest way, because, as every colonial woman knew, the single most boring activity involved in domestic production was spinning. I tell my students that there is only one thing more boring than spinning, and that's watching bass fishing on ESPN. So when being asked, families being asked to boycott the purchase of textiles, it was women who were critical in making this boycott work. And instantly, without any hesitation, women rose to the occasion. They saw themselves for the first time as participants in a public and political affair. They understood immediately that to participate in the boycott was, in fact, to be a political player. They took out spinning wheels. They spun homespun, that is, made at home. And interestingly, they called it Liberty cloth. This signaled that they understood that they had been politicized. I think one of the most radical things about the American Revolution was this extraordinary instant politicization of people who had been told as a gender that this was none of their concern throughout a century and a half of American colonial history. Women understood what they were doing. One young woman, a teenager, wrote, "We have commenced perfect statesmen. They called themselves Daughters of Liberty." And in fact, they did more than that. First, they published in the newspapers declarations of support